In Volume 38 of the Dragon Ball manga, Volume 22 in the Western Z releases, the following can be read on the first page.
It feels like things have gotten even more hectic since the year started. In addition to Dragon Ball, I have some work I'm doing for a video game, some work for V-Jump, and the work I'm doing with my friend designing model kits. And then, in whatever spare time I have left, I have to think up dozens of design plans for my company, Bird Studio. Just as I'm writhing in agony, my dog gets sick, and I've had to find time for trips to the vet. She's fine now. I want time to goof off. Akira Toriyama, 1994.
When I heard the news Akira Toriyama had passed away last year, I was deeply sad but also not surprised. Many mangaka, such as Toriyama, suffer extreme health issues due to the demands of running a weekly manga series. Even with assistants, editors, and now digital tools, it still seems like weekly is just too much for most artists. Yoshihiro Togashi, creator of two of my favorite manga ever, is pretty famous for his health issues and constant hiatuses. He has had back issues for decades now. Some of his notes are extremely sad. Recently, he said that he experiences anxiety when he thinks about just sitting in a chair, and he needs surgeries for things like his back. Kentaro Miura, creator of my second favorite manga ever, was, like many mangaka, extremely private. We didn't hear anything from him most of the time. No updates, no news, nothing, until the announcement of his passing. The sad truth is many mangaka pass away far too young. They give decades of their lives to provide exciting stories for us to enjoy. They give so much just to give so many children amazing stories to grow up with. To have had somebody like Akira Toriyama, who influenced millions of childhoods, was a blessing. I know I'm not alone when I say that as a young child, I would scream at the top of my lungs trying to go Super Saiyan, or to shoot a Kamehameha beam from my palms. Dragon Ball is my favorite manga of all time. It is full of whimsy, comedy, and adrenaline-pumping excitement. I spent many months last year thinking of some way to make an Akira Toriyama video, but I didn't want to come off like I was disingenuous or trying to use his passing as a way to get some stupid YouTube views. I don't really blame anybody for doing so. It is the ugly side of content creation. There were videos about Toriyama like 20 minutes after the news broke, but for me, I felt like I really needed a good reason to talk about the legend Akira Toriyama, and I think I finally have one. Needless to say, this video is dedicated to Akira Toriyama. Thank you for everything. On March 11th, 1995, Chrono Trigger released on the Super Famicom in Japan. Over the past 30 years, the game has held a pristine reputation. In 2021, a Japanese poll with over 50,000 participants voted for the top 100 games of all time, and Chrono Trigger landed at number 8. It's a game that many people would put at the very top of its entire genre. When any game holds a status like this for so long, it can become really hard to see the game at face value. Some will say it's a masterpiece and not listen to anything that might even attempt to challenge that claim. Others will immediately say it's overrated and disappointing and start nitpicking every single thing to find some flaws. They'll go to Reddit and say something like, "Am I the only one who thinks Chrono Trigger doesn't live up to the hype?" As I'm writing this video, I just finished my 4th playthrough of Chrono Trigger last week. I know, rookie numbers. Chrono Trigger is my favorite game ever made. It is a combination of music so incredible that I still can't believe it exists, gorgeous pixel art, a fantastic narrative, likable characters, tight pacing that is respectful of my time, and so much more. But when you think about it, it's kind of peculiar that this game always takes the spot of a top 5 JRPG. Chrono Trigger does not offer the customization complexities of a title such as Final Fantasy VI. Chrono Trigger doesn't offer any unique ideas on turn-based combat such as Shadow Hearts. Chrono Trigger doesn't have the expansive lore of the Trails series. Instead, this game offers a custom-tailored experience that is of the highest quality. A couple years ago, me and my friend decided to get some food at a restaurant in the middle of Chinatown. We were given hot tea instead of water at the start of our meal. My friend eventually did ask for a cup of water, and the waiter seemed hesitant at first but complied. We asked if he said anything offensive or wrong, and the waiter explained to us that their food was best enjoyed with the tea they gave us and not water. That's Chrono Trigger to me. Unless you're playing for the optional bonus endings, every playthrough of Chrono Trigger is going to be pretty identical to the last one. A lot of JRPGs, thanks to their customization mechanics, offer tons of replay value. For example, maybe the first time you played Dragon Quest VIII, you made your hero use a sword, but during your second playthrough, you decide to make him a boomerang knight. With Chrono Trigger, the only real customization I can think of is your equipment, who you use your tabs on, and which party members you use. That's really it. But I find myself replaying this game constantly because I just love every second of it. I love walking around the Millennial Fair with Marl in the beginning. I love the leafy shadows in the BC timeline. I love how 2300 AD kind of gives me Midgar vibes from Final Fantasy VII. I love the lack of music in Magus's castle. I love the moment you first reach Zell. I love it all. And listen, I'm sure there's going to be hundreds of 30th anniversary Chrono Trigger videos this year. I'm sure they're all going to dissect what makes the game so perfect, the minutia of the story and the gameplay. So let me just make this clear near the beginning of the video. I love every aspect of this game. If I had to add anything to it, I think it would be kind of cool if it had like the Super Mario RPG thing where you pick a stat to add 1.2 when you level up, but that's really it. Everything I could possibly want in a video game is here. So I'm going to try and talk about this game from a different angle. I want to talk about Akira Toriyama again. Akira Toriyama is absolutely integral to much of my enjoyment of Chrono Trigger. I firmly believe that in video games, his art style has never been captured with so much grace and elegance and respect as it was in Chrono Trigger, at least not in a 2D game. Toriyama gave his all to Chrono Trigger. And it's important to remember that he was up to his neck in work at the time. I went through my Dragon Ball manga looking for a volume published around the time Chrono Trigger began development or released, and I found one with the snippet that you heard at the beginning of this video. To say that this man was busy would be a major understatement. And yet when you look at the many pieces of art that he drew for this game, it is some of his very best. Before I get into my own take, I want to show you a snippet of an interview I found from some Japanese gaming magazines in 1995. I think they only further my point. Akira Toriyama is a huge portion of Chrono Trigger's spirit.
Did Akira Toriyama also participate in the meetings?
He did. He only did the character illustrations and concept art, but those illustrations gave us a lot of inspiration. They gave us ideas about the world of Chrono Trigger and the character dramas. It's really amazing how many ideas we got just from looking at them.
Was it difficult translating Toriyama's concept art into game sprites?
Yeah, I created the in-game monster graphics based off the designs Toriyama gave me, but figuring out how they should actually move was a challenge. For example, Toriyama's illustrations didn't show the backside of the monsters, so I had to just imagine what he would have drawn and do my best. Also, I won't go into the details here, but for Lavos' design, we argued a lot at Square about how Toriyama would have drawn it, and how to capture his style. Toriyama would never draw something like that. It got pretty heated. In the last game I worked on, Final Fantasy VI, the character graphics were all made according to my taste. With Chrono Trigger, I felt that if I exerted too much control over it, it would turn out too much like Final Fantasy. So when I was making the background and map graphics, I would put the character sprites on the screen mockups while I worked, so my backgrounds matched the atmosphere and feel of Toriyama's character designs. I think the results came out well.
Next, I would like to show you a portion of a promotional VHS tape that the magazine V-Jump put out 1 year before Chrono Trigger released. I didn't even know this thing existed until I did some research for this video, and it's just so cool that they used to do stuff like this for video game launches.
こんにちは、鳥山明です。ドラゴンクエストがあって、ファイナルファンタジーがあって、割と似てるようで両極を成してるロールプレイングゲーム がある意味で合体するわけじゃないですか。非常にスクエアのグラフィックと堀井さんの分かりやすさっていうんですか、あの辺りがうまく合体して本当にいいとこ取りかなっていう感じはするんですけどね。両方の途中のゲームが3時間分ぐらいまでできてるやつを貸していただいたんですけど、びっくりしました。グラフィックがあんまり綺麗で、いわゆる風景とか細かく書き込みすぎるほどゲームとしては見にくくなると思うんですよ。でもかなり細かく、ぼかしとか使ってできてるのに非常に見やすかったから、あの点が一番驚きましたね。本当に忠実にやってもらってて、あんまり忠実すぎて本当はもっとすごい画面でできるんじゃないかと思うのに僕に合わせてもらっちゃったみたいで。
I think it's really cool that they don't just credit Toriyama as like a character designer or art director, they actually credit him as game creator. And we hear it straight from Toriyama's mouth that he and Yuji Horii spent a good amount of time just going over the exact artistic direction they should take when making a game for the Super Nintendo. And we can see evidence of that attention to detail because he didn't just draw big scenes in the game like when you fight Magus, he drew this incredibly minor scene like when you're exploring the magic cave and these exact monsters surprise you out of the hole and the rat enemies come at you too. I don't know how common it was to do this for games back then. I don't think it's even common today to draw such minor scenes. And again, we're not just talking about concept art, we're talking about fully finished, gorgeous pieces of art. In 1985, the first Dragon Quest title began development. Akira Toriyama's editor at the time, Kazuhiko Torishima, had a connection to Yuji Horii, creator of Dragon Quest. He was able to secure Toriyama the job as character designer for the game. And for the entirety of the series' history, Toriyama drew the character and monster designs for each mainline Dragon Quest title. Dragon Quest is well known for its overwhelming popularity over in Japan, even spawning an urban legend that a law was passed to only release new Dragon Quest games on Sunday so kids don't skip school to play it. It's not true, but it's still kinda funny. It's one of my favorite series ever. I've played and finished many of its games. But there was always one thing I found a little strange about the older Dragon Quest games, and maybe it's just me. I never really felt like those games accurately translated Akira Toriyama's art style very well. Of course, starting on the very limited Famicom didn't give the developers many options in terms of art style. But then you get to the Super Famicom and you see some staples like the spiky hair and the cute looking monsters. I also want to mention that for the first 7 games in the series, you cannot see your characters in combat, and the enemies are just static sprites. So arguably, the two most important designs he did for these games, the heroes and the enemies, do not reach their fullest potential. It also doesn't help that Dragon Quest is well known for reusing NPC designs. Like this guy, for example. You'll be seeing him in most Dragon Quest games, wandering villages or running weapon shops. And he's not alone. Many NPC designs are reused throughout the games. This helps the series follow its spirit of tradition. But again, I'm not sure if it does Akira Toriyama, one of the most legendary artists from Japan, much justice. As technology advanced, we get to the PlayStation 1, and you would think that with 3D graphics we might get a more recognizably Toriyama game. Not really. Toriyama did the character designs for Square published fighting games Tobo 1 and 2, but if you just saw a random clip of these games online, would you even be able to guess that? At least with Tobo 1, the Japanese box art was clearly his work, but with Tobo 2, they just didn't even care, even in Japan, which is just such a wasted opportunity. In the year 2000, the widely anticipated Dragon Quest VII was released. Because of fan feedback, Dragon Quest VII remained 2D. Now, I do think Dragon Quest VII is noteworthy because it was announced in 1996, 1 year after the Dragon Ball manga had ended. Toriyama's art style very clearly changed multiple times over the course of his career. When he started out with Dr. Slump and into the early volumes of Dragon Ball, you could see that his art was very round, cute, chibi, and it had a bouncy feeling to it. You could see the animations play in your head as you read his work. And the way he just drew lines and ricocheting energy beams, it is so animated and alive. But by the time we get to the second half of Dragon Ball, aka Dragon Ball Z in the West, we get to a much more angular, sharper, muscular art style. Personally, I love both styles, but I do think the further you get into Dragon Ball, the less detail we see. I'm sure Toriyama was very tired after a decade of weekly serialization. I think overall, the rounder, earlier art style feels a tad bit more charming and more detailed, but if I had to pick my favorite, it would be that sharper, muscular, angry art style we see a couple of years later. There's just something so endearing and instantly recognizable about it. And for many people, myself included, this sharper style is prime Akira Toriyama artwork. He was at his absolute peak until the very late 90s. He dominated for almost 2 decades if you include Dr. Slump. After Dragon Ball, you can immediately see that Toriyama began to experiment with different styles of character designs. In 1997, with Kawa, we see Toriyama go back to his cuter style, but with much less emphasis on detail. I love this manga, it's a personal favorite of mine. And around the same time, to bring it back to Dragon Quest VII, he did the designs for that game. I say all this because just look at the main heroes of Dragon Quest VII. They're childish, not very cool looking, kind of plain too. Dragon Quest VIII does have much cooler characters, but by the time we get to things like Blue Dragon, Gia, and Jocko the Space Patrolman, the difference is pretty clear to me. These newer characters are skinnier and usually have shorter, much less recognizable hair. And the Dragon Quest XI cast is not that cool either. I think by this point, Toriyama was just trying to deviate from expectations. So to sum it all up, it sucks that by the time gaming had really good 3D graphics, Toriyama's peak art and character designs were beginning to fade into history, and I don't blame him. The man made a series so legendary that very few artists could ever hope to achieve that level of worldwide fame. If I was him, I probably would have slowed down too. Again, I do want to stress that Dragon Quest VIII is amazing, it has cool character designs, and it translates his style perfectly. So there's an exception, and of course, the PS2 Dragon Ball fighting games like Budokai, Budokai Tenkaichi, those adapt his art style incredibly well too. But as I said earlier, I am mostly focusing on 2D games for this video. By the time Chrono Trigger came out, he had been working on Dragon Quest for 9 years. And again, I just don't see much of him in these games. And I'm not throwing specific shade at Dragon Quest, because there's examples of this happening even much later. A game like Lost Odyssey, which had work done by the incredible Takehiko Inoue of Vagabond fame and Slam Dunk fame, this game does not really scream Inoue to me. Maybe it's just hard to bring a specific art style into games. Overall, I do prefer 2D games. I love pixel art with all of my heart, and I have to assume that pixel art can be a little bit more challenging when it comes to adapting an art style. Just look at the breathtaking work that Yoshitaka Amano did for Final Fantasy VI. Look at this artwork, and then when you look at the game, you realize that there's really not much they could do to put that fine art into the game. They did try with the character portraits with some mixed success. So to me, any game that could combine the playful and feisty art of 1990s prime Akira Toriyama and pixel graphics would be a home run for me. And that home run is named Chrono Trigger. The imp enemies are clearly Namekians. Marl's design looks very similar to one of Bulma's early outfits in Dragon Ball, just with blonde hair and without a vest. The purple and white we see in Lavos' final form reminds me much of Frieza's color scheme. Launched from Dragon Ball is basically Ayla. The domes we see in 1999 and 2300 remind me of the very circular architecture in Central City. Toriyama had a fascination and love for drawing round, chunky machines, but he also loved dinosaurs. He had dinosaurs coexisting with machines in the world of Dragon Ball, and in Chrono Trigger, we see plenty of these machines, especially in the future era and with Robo specifically, but of course, we get plenty of fat dinosaurs as well. Chrono looks like he would fit right in with the Z Fighters. The fusion of Masa and Moon into Masamune reminds me of the fusion dance from Dragon Ball Z. And Luca might be one of my favorite Toriyama designs ever. Once you see those classic boots and tunic, you already knew who drew this. There's a bit of modernism with the biker shorts, and of course her helmet is iconic. You just had to get a machine in there, didn't you, Toriyama? And I brought up the character portraits in Final Fantasy VI, but just look at the character portraits here. This is stunning work. It looks like Toriyama himself put this into the game. I love the little details like the light reflecting on Luca's glasses or Magus's earring. Incredible stuff. And I know what you're probably thinking. I'm essentially saying that, okay, Toriyama art looks like Toriyama art, but I think his influence goes further than just the art style. Sometimes there's moments in the story in terms of tone and writing that feel like it could be in a Toriyama manga. Ozzy, Flea, and Slash remind me of Emperor Pilaf, Shu, and Mai, an inept trio of villains that you aren't meant to take seriously. You can finish their side quests in like 15 minutes because of how dumb these guys are, and I love that. Toriyama also had a fascination with taking villains and turning them into heroes, like Piccolo, Vegeta, or Android 18. And we see that amazingly done here with Magus. For like the first half of the game, you think that Magus is nothing but a scumbag, and don't get me wrong, he is a scumbag, but then you just realize at the end of the day, he just wants to save his big sister. As mentioned in the interview snippets before, Toriyama did indeed sit in the meetings during development, at least some of them, and the drawings influenced the style of stories we see in this game. It feels like to me there's an alternate universe where I would see a Chrono Trigger manga in a bookstore. And I really do think that if Chrono Trigger looked more like this, or even this, my love for this game wouldn't be the same. Think about it. If Square did what they did with the contemporary Final Fantasy games and only showed one character on the screen, you wouldn't even get to see the detailed character sprites, unique walk and run animations that everybody has. You wouldn't be able to see their idle animations. And a huge part of the appeal of this game are the stunning animations of the text. Seeing Chrono's hair go crazy like a Super Saiyan never gets old to me. So while I do think this game may lack the complexity of other titles in its genre, no game comes close to the style of Chrono Trigger. For the kids out there, Chrono Trigger has drip. Chrono Trigger has the sauce. No game comes close. Not even its sequel, Chrono Cross, which I also love. There's a couple of key issues in this game, and the art is not one of them. However, it is missing that pizzazz of Trigger. We are beyond lucky that we have so much official art for this game. Between the instruction manuals, magazines, and player guides, there is so much art. There are tons of games I love where all I get is like 3 or 4 pieces of official art, and it sucks. Thankfully, that is not the case here. Because of the time-traveling nature of the game, Toriyama was able to draw all of his favorite things. It was the ultimate excuse to express himself, and the programmers really cared about the life expressed in these characters. In one interview, some of the key people were asked who their favorite character in the game was, and some of the answers are so oddly specific and all for good reasons. For example, Akiyoshi Masuda said that he was particularly fond of the bat enemy in the game because of his blood-sucking and death animations. Takashi Tokita chimes in and mentions that simply having the enemies being animated during battle adds so much, and it's true. As I said earlier, in Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy games at the time, the enemies were static drawings, but in Chrono Trigger, they move around. It adds this animated nature to the game, and unlike Dragon Quest, you can see your heroes fighting, and unlike Final Fantasy, the animations are much more detailed. This is the power of a 1995 Super Nintendo game. The PlayStation came out 1 year before Chrono Trigger. Everything from the specific time this game came out to Toriyama's involvement with the Dream Team contributes to making this game feel like a once-in-a-lifetime miracle. And lastly, I want to talk about how the Toriyama influence may have even spread to the pacing of the game. There's a lot of JRPGs that I would compare to a book. Games filled with lore, detailed character backstories, and landscapes rich with detail. This game is much more like a comic book, or in this case, a manga. The pacing is lightning fast. No game has had a better first 2 hours than this one. You go from just being a kid at a festival to making friends with a talking frog, discovering a secret prison underneath a church, to the trial scene, fighting a fire-breathing tank, and discovering the apocalypse within 2 hours. You can beat this game and do all of the side quests in under 30 hours if you know what you're doing. This is why one of my biggest points of criticism with games today is pacing. JRPGs are notorious for having less than ideal pacing, and the breakneck speed of this game's story once again goes hand in hand with the manga aesthetic. Obviously, I'm not saying that Akira Toriyama was in the Squaresoft office being like, hey, let's make sure this game is paced really well, guys. But I just think that the development of this game was so harmonious with the energy given by the Dream Team, of which Toriyama was a key part of. I tried to dig up more interviews and behind the scenes information for Chrono Trigger. I tried to find anything that Toriyama said about the game, but I couldn't really find anything. So of course this is just a theory on my sake, but I do think Toriyama was giving a lot of ideas for the story or the character arcs. And I do think that by this point in his career, whenever he stepped into the office, he was probably looked at as an unbelievable legend. And as you can tell by the interview snippets, the people working on this game took translating Akira Toriyama's art style very seriously. And I think it's because of that faithfulness to this legend that we got such an amazing game. I just can't understate how important this man's work is to me. I mean, I'm about to be 28 in a couple of months, and still when I go to the gym, I think about Goku, right? Like, I want to have a Goku body, of course. And I think it's that beautiful level of aspiration and inspiration that this man's work gave me is why I feel indebted to him. He changed so many people's lives, mine included. I've read much of his work. I read all of Dragon Ball, I read a couple of volumes of Dr. Slump, I read Kawa, I read Sandland, I played through Blue Dragon, tons of the Dragon Quest games, I have the Dragon Quest art book. I am well versed in the world of Akira Toriyama's work, and while I will always say that Dragon Ball is his magnum opus, I think Chrono Trigger will always be my favorite thing he's done. So again, one last time, I just want to say thank you to Akira Toriyama.